or a no? Yes? Okay. All right. So the topic of my talk this morning is movable type enterprise architecture. And I'm basically going to focus almost entirely on the act of rebuilding, because that is sort of, the sort of basic act of blogging, and using movable type is literally building pages. So, this morning and throughout the rest of the afternoon, we're going to be talking about a lot of the other features in movable type, but for today's, for this hour, we're really going to focus on what it takes to rebuild pages and what that process looks like. Just a little bit about myself. My name is David Jacobs. I'm a partner in a company called Apperceptive here in New York City. We build blogs and large sort of social networking websites for media companies. Okay, so you're all somewhat familiar with movable type, and you know that basically the term for writing files is called rebuilding. And like any sort of software on the internet, consumer software, the arc of development of movable type has gone from sort of the hobbyist to the consumer to the business, and now it's in the enterprise. And when you talk about something as simple as writing pages, but you look at sort of the different systems involved in that arc, there's a lot of different processes by which you can do that. So I just wanted to talk through the history of how people rebuild pages in movable type, because it's something that people take for granted as it happens, but in reality there's a lot going on. So the way that the vast majority of movable type systems work, and the way they've worked from for the last 6 years, is basically that you're in movable type and you save an entry and the page gets rebuilt. And if you're saving like a category template, it knows to publish category templates. If you're saving a new entry, it's aware of sort of the context around that entry. So if that entry is in 2 categories and you have weekly archives, it will rebuild your date-based archives, your category archives, and of course your indexes and individual archives. And it sounds like a lot of work, basically because it is. So the way movable type started out, it was basically for hobbyists and bloggers, and who were living on shared hosting environments. So you would do something like you would save a page, and it would kick off a process that would be sort of inside the web server, write out pages, and that was fine, basically, because it was the beginnings of blogging, and everyone had sort of small blogs, and their users were maybe just themselves and their friends. But now, when you talk about building blogs for sites like, iVillage is here, sites like NBC, Condé Nast, Boeing, Intel, companies like that, you have a higher expectation for the performance and how that rebuilding cycle is going to happen. So the sort of technical history is there was the rebuilding in the browser, which is the process I just discussed. And then there were a bunch of different companies over time that started the idea of rebuilding asynchronously. And this basically means that act of rebuilding a page happened outside the browser. So I think the first company to do this was actually Gawker did it soon after they launched, and they did it with a little hack. And I'm sorry, this is sort of I'm erring on the technical side of conversations. So if you have any questions, you want me to slow down, just stop me. But basically the way it worked was that when you did something, instead of rebuilding a page right away, a ticket would be written, and a little like an rsync job would kick off, so that you had many different servers besides the movable type server that were actually hosting pages. So that was a process that was done by a lot of sites like Gawker, a lot of other media blogs like In the City, Gothamist, and Curbed, and many other sites ran like that. And it worked well for the time, because there were a lot of, just as like businesses were sort of bootstrapping themselves along blogging, on the business model side and the technology side, that was the way things were happening. So that was fine for that scenario, but it hasn't worked as much for the enterprise world, where you have sort of you have expectations about 100% uptime. You have expectations where you're offering your brand, through a blog. That means if your blog is down, people feel like your brand is down. So it has to be up all the time. There were 2 plugins that were developed by 6 Apart in the community. The first one was Rebuild Less, which basically took that sort of roles and jobs that I spoke about. Like when you save an entry, maybe you don't actually have to rebuild the category archive every time. Maybe you can just rebuild it once a day or once a week. Same for the weekly and monthly and yearly archives that movable type is generating. So that was what the Rebuild Less plugin did. and that is still available on code.sixapart.com. And if you have if you're sort of in between, like you're a small business blog, or you're running a nonprofit, then Rebuild Less is probably the right way to do that. For the rest of this talk, I'm really going to focus on the Rebuild Q, which is sort of the next level. Basically, the way the Rebuild Q works is it sort of takes what was the Gawker architecture and what was the Gothamist architecture to the next level, where movable type no longer relies on the browser or the web server for rebuilding at all. The way it works is that there's sort of a separate process and a separate daemon that is responsible for rebuilding pages. And I have so this slide basically shows sort of our exemplary enterprise architecture, and I'm going to talk through it sort of one at a time. I know it's basically, this is not sort of the way people are used to looking at blogs. They're used to thinking like, I have my movable type account, or I have a Blogger account, or that maybe publishes via FTP. And what I do is I have one server and something happens, and then maybe a page gets pushed somewhere else, and that's the end of it. But if you have a blog, or you have a system like with thousands and tens of thousands of authors, then you need something a little more than that. So I'm just going to step through this diagram from right to left and show sort of the arc of the way a movable type enterprise page gets rebuilt. And again, this is not the way movable type has to work, but this is the way, when we do our very large installations, this is how Apperceptive rolls them out. So we just heard Bern talk about authentication. On this diagram in the upper right, we have the LDAP server. But as Bern just showed, that no longer has to be LDAP. It could be Shibboleth or Oracle Single Sign-On, or it can be your company's custom authentication. Basically every company, every large media company and most large sort of intranet and knowledge wire companies have their own authentication system, for better or for worse. It's not dissimilar to like everyone had shopping cart software in 1999 because it was like not yet a sort of commoditized thing. That's like authentication systems are the sort of shopping carts 5 years later. And this is the problem that movable type enterprise is solving, as Bern just showed. So you have an authentication server, then you basically are clustering the application into 4 pieces. The first is your editor servers, the second is your reader servers, the third is your rebuilding servers, and the fourth is your sort of web servers. And this is where your user-facing files will go. So I'm going to go through pretty quickly the first 2. Basically, the way movable type has worked for several years, actually, is that it's possible to cluster the reader's applications and the editor's applications on different servers. So, for instance, different media companies have different constraints. We have some clients at Apperceptive who say, we don't have a lot of comments. We actually don't care about comments. The important thing for us is that when someone comes to our website, they see new content. When an editor publishes a page, I need that page to appear in 30 seconds. Like, we are a breaking news site. We are a video site, we're an MP3 blog, we're a city blog. So the way this works is that we would scale these servers up so that there was a little more capacity here. And, assuming there's a limited budget, as there always is, we would scale down sort of commenting servers. Likewise, we have some clients who feel like, so an example of that would be something like the Gothamist blogs or the Gawker blogs, where they do have a lot of editors, they do have a lot of comments, but the most important thing is that throughout the day, someone is bored at work and they hit reload on their browser, and your content is there first. So that would be an example of when you would want the editor's application to be more prominent. The reader's application is a blogs like you look at like celebrity blogs or blogs like the Top Chef blogs or any of the Bravo blogs. I don't know how many of you follow their sites, but like for a lot of the Bravo shows, they will have like every Wednesday after Top Chef airs, each of the Top Chef stars will make one blog post. And then throughout the week, there's thousands of comments on that post. Like everyone is talking to like Tom Colicchio or Padma Lakshmi or whoever is on the show, and your audience feels like they're communicating directly with the stars. And this is something that is obviously very profound, both for your brand and for your audience, and it's something that is more or less completely unique to blogging. In this scenario, you have many hundreds of times the server load caused by your reader's activity than by your editor's activity. Really, like, you're looking at numbers like 5 to 10 posts on a blog every 2 weeks. And for instance, like in the case of like shows like the Bravo reality shows that only run new episodes 9 or 12 weeks a year, then you're looking at over year, you might have less than 100 posts on a blog. But if you go to those blogs like today, you'll see that there are still like debates and there's a community there. it lives in the comments. So in that scenario, obviously the commenters have a lot more activity than the readers. So this first thing is, this is actually a real sort of sea change in the way people address blog technology, because it used to be that if you wanted to run movable type for a side project or for a book or for even a small company, you would get like a shared hosting account and put movable type there, and it was just this one monolithic thing. But with the sort of modern behavior of bloggers and audiences, that just doesn't work anymore. So the third group of servers is the rebuild queue servers. And the way this works is these lines here basically are from the editors and readers servers to a load balancer, and then also, of course, the authentication. And this basically says that anyone who hits these servers is doing so at the application level. They're leaving a comment, or they're logging in, or something like that. The actual act of publishing your pages is on a completely different set of servers. And this is made possible by the rebuild queue plugin. And the reason this is important is because, say for instance, like, I'll keep going with the Top Chef metaphor. There's like a very controversial episode of Top Chef. I don't know how many of you are Top Chef fans, but there was like an argument in the third to last episode of the season. There was actually a physical fight, no spoilers, but there was a physical confrontation. And at that episode, there were, that night, there were hundreds of live comments. And this is like, this is not one of our sites. I'm speaking as a fan, not as a builder. Obviously I'm coming from an architecture perspective, but I'm also a fan of this blog. So here was this night when you, as sort of a blog administrator, this is your moment of great success, right? You have a media property, the media property, like you have all the buzz you want. You have like clearly sort of like a viral conversation is going on. And you have hundreds of comments an hour. The reason you need your comments and your rebuild activities to be happening on different servers is because you just don't want to be punished for your success, right? Because obviously if more people are commenting, movable type is rebuilding, and at the same time, if it's rebuilding more often, it's going to slow down comments. And this is just like, a fact of life. Like, servers have a limited number of cycles. So it's really important that however you sort of spec out this array of servers, that you can say, we understand that, for instance, in like a television blog, you need to have a moment where you can scale for your comments so that they can, you can accept as many comments as you want, but at the same time, also be rebuilding those pages. Because, like, basically, the ideal scenario for you is that people are arguing and having, using your sort of blog comments like forums. And we're going to talk a little more later in the afternoon about explicitly using blogs as forums. But in any blog, every blog has one thread, which is like a community to itself, where there's a conversation and activities going on. So that's the sort of what you want to support here with this architecture. So the way the rebuild queue works is in this scenario, like, you basically, traditionally a movable type has something has happened, like a comment or a post, and you build a page, right? But in the case of our like Top Chef discussion, if there's 150 comments happening every 10 minutes, you really don't want to rebuild your pages 150 times. Maybe you really want to rebuild it only once a minute, which is acceptable because your users are reloading. They may not be reloading more often than once a minute or once every 30 seconds. But at the same time, if you're rebuilding these pages at this sort of outrageous rate, then all of the performance is going to be compromised. And really, the worst case scenario is that someone like comes on to give their opinion and to enter in a debate, and they're denied because of like a server issue. So, and then sort of the last part of the diagram here, and this is something that predates like blogs and Web 2.0, is that web servers have always sort of, large web companies have always had sort of a separate place for their user-facing content to live. So in this case, that's these sort of 3 purple servers. So whenever like an editor edits a page, editors can edit, publish directly, or comments can generate rebuild queue processes, and that pushes out to your users. And then sort of the last thing on the right here, I have the database servers, and this is just sort of to illustrate that in all of these activities we're talking about, these are all database-dependent activities. Any sort of modern application is completely dependent on the database being up and active and fast. Yeah.
So in this case, are your editors overriding the rebuild queue?
Right. Well, this is an option that's in the rebuild queue. I didn't want to go too deep into the settings, but the way the rebuild queue works is like if someone, say you have like a very active thread, and some commenter says something offensive, or you don't have moderation on, you really need your editors to have the capability to be able to overwrite those files and push straight to live. Like if I'm deleting a comment, or I want to edit my post, I made a mistake in my post. So in this sort of very active environment, you need to be able to override the rebuild queue server. But in the case of like comments, that always will go through the rebuild queue. Well, the issue with dynamic publishing, and I'm glad you asked, Bernd, is that when you move with dynamic publishing, I mean, here we basically have, I've tried to sort of talk about the arc from like hobbyist to consumer to enterprise product. And, when you start with like a hobbyist or a consumer or a small business product, it's often like on a single server, and it's also, you have a single point of failure, which is a single server. In that scenario, dynamic publishing is fine. Because if something happens to that server, then your site is down, right? In this scenario, there's many servers, right? You have load balancers, you have flat web servers, editors, commenters, and rebuild servers, and then you probably have multiple databases, right? So if, for instance, you're having like this Top Chef discussion, and your editor server goes down, you need your environment to be able to withstand that, right? And if you have dynamic publishing, basically every bit of these layers are in serial. So if like any element of your application goes down, then your entire website goes down. And so this is like, the canonical example I always use is like a lot of gadget blogs will cover the Apple keynote or like the Microsoft conferences in Las Vegas, and like clockwork, every time they're down. So when we talk about like the Top Chef example, like the moment that should be your greatest success, when your community is the most active, is the most painful for you, and your site is most likely to fail. So when you have dynamic publishing, if any element in this chart gets overloaded, then your entire server is down. Or on the other hand, if you have like a situation like with a busy moment, and like your editor server goes down, it's okay because you can still serve pages. They've been published, they've already been published here. People can still leave comments. If your database goes down, you even like the worst case is your database goes down and people can't leave comments. But in that scenario, you've still published flat pages, so when people go to look at your brand is still there. I mean, the worst case possible is that someone says, I want to, it's like you're inviting someone into your house when you build a website. You want them to have a comfortable experience. And the absolute worst experience you can offer is that someone tries to come and do something on your site, and their return is like an error page. So, and with this, architecture, that's a much, much rarer occurrence. Of course, like 100% uptime simply doesn't exist. But this, is much closer to that.
Is there an option to operate in that fashion if you choose to? Because I mean, for someone like us, we're behind Akamai anyway, so
right.
To be in a dynamic publishing environment is basically the same as this.
Right. So if you have an external service, and it could be Akamai, or it could be like hosting your videos on like Rever, or hosting your static assets in something like Kick Apps. Right. Then you could use dynamic publishing, but still, like when your database goes down, you're still extremely vulnerable to any new content being published. And when you like run out of your Akamai time to life,
all of our database is down, all our sites are down. So
right. Well, that's a situation you want to avoid, because you don't cache all of your pages in Akamai. And if even if you do, it's still very expensive.
And you need to very granularly to react to the cache change and validation.
And and again, this is like, we've done very specific diagrams like this for our clients, but we sort of have this version of it, which is intentionally abstract. I mean, every system in the world is different. We have some clients who run these on virtual servers and swear like virtual servers is the only way to afford this kind of architecture. And there's some clients who are like, why in the world would I buy hardware and then cripple it by running it virtually? You know what I mean? Why would I just like give away my processor cycles? Likewise, people talk the same way about like MySQL versus Oracle, or different authentication systems. People say like, why in the world would I pay for an Oracle license? And then some people say like, why in the world would I use free database software? So, and as we talk about sort of dynamic versus static, obviously every solution has to fit to your, what your team is comfortable with and what kind of technologies you deploy.
Yeah. Speaking of Akamai, do you have any integration with the cache validation and everything and that upon publishing?
Well, Akamai, there's two ways to run Akamai. as I understand it. One way is you can configure sort of an endpoint where Akamai pulls your site and looks for, tries to cache something if it's new. And the other is in which you sort of are pushing Akamai and pinging them when you publish something new. So Jay talked about sort of plugins this morning. You could easily write a plugin. His plugin just said hello world. You could have a plugin that on every action lets Akamai know, hey, this has been updated. The next time someone looks for this page, come get our fresher version.
But basically, upon reveal, that's what you have.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't need to push to Akamai, actually. The two ways you put it out, they actually combine.
Right.
So there is
sure.
reverse promising plus rebuilding cache command.
Totally. And it's not limited to Akamai. It's limited to any sort of third party that posts assets to your website. So I have one more slide. People often, like a lot of corporate environments will see this and they're worried about spam. They're worried about having sort of like all of their servers exposed to the world. So this is sort of an alternative architecture, which is, we actually 6apart distributes this diagram, so it's sort of nice stuff on their behalf. Has their logo on it, which we like. Basically, the only difference here is you still have your sort of 3 servers, your database, and your editors and readers coming in from different places. But here you have this line, right, where the only thing that can go out from movable type is pages generated by the rebuild queue, and the only thing that can come in are authenticated comments. And everything else just gets denied at the firewall level. And anyone who's run like a reasonably sized application, whether it's like a blog or any kind of social network or an email server, knows that spam is an issue. So what you can do is, obviously with modern web servers, you can set rules that say like, I only allow these, comments from these people. I only allow comments from people with these kinds of configurations. Like I only allow people who have valid cookies from my authentication system. This is something, again, that is natively supported in technology. Burn just demoed. It's coming out later this year. And so this is like sort of our, nicer version of this, which really illustrates that, just because you have all these servers doesn't mean all of them have to be open to the world. For instance, you might not want your editorial application to be, if you have an internal application, all of your editors are employees. There's no reason to have your editor's box, which is here, accessible to anyone except people who are on your VPN. But at the same time, of course, you do need people to hit the application because they're commenting. Maybe you have a recommend plugin, maybe you have a profile plugin, and I mean sort of all the other activities and plugins you can we'll talk about later this afternoon when we talk about community and movable type. So, and that's another reason why the sort of editor servers and the sort of comment servers are sequestered in different places, because if there is ever like a security breach on your servers or in any of the software that you run on your servers, you need to have these data, have these environments be segregated from one another. So I actually intentionally sort of made the presentation very short because I know people often have a lot of questions about this. So I actually left the rest of the time for questions. If you guys want to ask anything else about the way the rebuild queue works or the way publishing works in movable type. There are some things coming. Right now, this is still all lives in one application. We're working with 6apart on sort of like breaking out the sort of packaging of movable type so that you can install like rebuild queue as a standalone server and comments as a standalone server. And the editor's application as its own server. We have like a Debian installer package that we built last year, so that if you a lot of developers want to, everyone runs movable type on their own laptop or server who's like a developer. So if you have like a Linux installation on your desktop and you just want to run movable type locally and test this stuff out, you can do that too. The other thing is we're always looking to make the sort of user experience, the administrative experience better, because there's been a lot of energy put into making blogs designed beautifully. But there's been a little less attention on the plugin side to plugin developers making a really great user experience for blog administrators. And obviously, like the majority of the time that you guys spend in the movable type application is not spent in plugins, but when it is spent in plugins, it's really important that that's a great experience. So we're working on that side of it too. Chad, you had a question?
Yeah, in your first illustration, you had multiple rebuild queue servers.
Right.
How are you determining how do you do that? Do you run like one queue for the same worker ID, or do you run multiple workers? How do you size that and make that determination?
Right. So the way rebuild queue works, Chad asked a question about how we divvy up workers, is that it doesn't have to be one server that pushes out pages. You can actually have many different workers. So as you scale up your servers, you can push out, you can have 10 pages being built concurrently, or 100 pages being built concurrently, and you can assign different workers to work harder. So here we do, Chad noticed we had multiple rebuild queue servers. We basically scale this so that each rebuild queue server is capable of building every page, but they work on a staggered basis. So the worst case is your servers go down, or one of your servers goes down, and your page just builds sort of a beat slower, but they still build. In terms of workers, the rebuild queue lets you sort of configure, like, I have this worker, I want this to build X many pages a minute. And in general, like, we feel like, our sort of internal metric for these servers is we want to build 1,000 pages a minute. So we feel like the rebuild queue isn't done until we've built 1,000 pages a minute, which is like a reasonable number for any sort of like sized blog, a single worker. So the way we scaled sites like, I think I could say the Gothamist, without giving away any company secrets, is they have 18 blogs. And they have 18 blogs that are almost all in distinct time zones around literally the world. I took down the server one night to update the recommended software on Saturday at 4 a.m. And I was rolling out the new plugin at like 4:06. I had an angry email from Shanghai, like, I'm trying to, there's breaking news. So, it's sort of around the clock uptime is very important. So we've assigned each blog has 2 workers of its own. So there's some redundancy there. And they're scaled in terms of the size of the jobs they take, in terms of the size of the blog. So the Gothamist blog publishes out many more pages than Austinist. And so we don't want Austinist and Gothamist to be grabbing 500 or 1,000 pages every minute per worker. We want Gothamist to be growing maybe 5 times as many as Austinist. Because we do just have one, in this scenario, we just have one server that's doing all the rebuilding. And again, it's like Gothamist, any sort of local site, any local news site, you have to allow for those peaks. And again, it's like people joke about the sort of board at work networks, like BWN's the new biggest 3-letter media company. But you sit and look at weblog traffic, like you look at it at like lunchtime, you look at it at like 3 o'clock when people slow down, and that's when you have the spikes in activity. And that's when, like, if you look like CNN and New York One and all these news sites, they all publish their breaking news not when it happens, but when they think people are sitting down, right? When the people have slowdowns in their work. So, basically we have sort of staggered the time and the workers and the blogs to account for those sort of peaks and flows. So if you're a site like, for instance, Top Chef, it's not one of our blogs, but it's my favorite example. Like, they're very active, at like 11 o'clock. The show ends at 11 on the East Coast, and they have this big push. And then the show on the West Coast ends at 2, and they have another big push. You know what I mean? Which is a slightly smaller push. So for there, that's sort of a different worker architecture than something like, the Garden Voices blog, which is an iVillage blog, that is probably active all day, right? But especially in the morning. Does that answer your question?
I see one problem with this configuration is that actual blog publishing database is the same as comments database.
Right.
And what, as you described, it's reasonable to have editing interfaces being in the office,
right,
and commenting being closer to live production. And in our case, for example, they're separate.
Right. So yeah, this I hear your concern. This diagram again is like abstracted, but the movable type database in any architecture, you can have different roles, different database roles. So this doesn't have to be the same database user that's always hitting the movable type database. So for the authenticated editor user, this is the editor that is creating entries and templates. And when you update a plugin, they may be dropping and adding tables. When you upgrade the application, it drops the session table and makes a new one. So this needs to be a user with absolute power. So that might be your empty root user, right? If you have a comments user, all you need to do is you have your comments table, you have your session table for your comments, you have your commenters table for authenticated commenters, and then you might have a recommend table, you might have a user profile table, you might have an extra fields table that your users can give you feedback, right? So you can create a user that only has insert and update privileges on those tables. And since these are different servers, you can affect the MT configuration so that when I'm coming from this server, I'm like the root user. You know, I'm like the MT user. When I come from this server, I'm like the MT commenter user.
No, my concern is actually not the security in this case,
Right.
but the reliability. Basically, I don't
Right.
want common servers to rely on availability of main server,
Right.
the editing servers at all.
Right.
And simply because those environments are managed by different
Right.
entities, and
Right, sure. I mean, I guess...
I can't be sure.
Right. No, two points here. One is, in this whole diagram, all of this, and, you know, I've worked in, you know, blogs since, like, you know, 1999 I started blogging. I've never seen the database be the scaling issue. We always, and part of that is because we always say this has to be the biggest server, this has to be, you know, this is your big iron here, because it's obviously the sort of easiest point of failure, as you know. But in the movable type architecture, like going from MT object driver on, this has always been sort of the best actor in performance. The other point is that the movable type object driver configuration as it is now completely supports, you know, you just give it an endpoint, right? So in Oracle, that doesn't have to be a single server. It can be a cluster of servers, right? And in MySQL, you can have like a master-slave relationship between, you know, two MySQL servers so that you fail over within like 20 seconds of one going down, or as often as you need to pull it. And then actually, there's a company called LogicWorks. That's a hosting company here in the city, and they actually
we host with them actually.
yeah, you host with them. So they're basically like they employ like the world's top MySQL experts. And so and they actually have a system that is like sort of beyond the usual like MySQL master-slave configuration. They have what's called a master-master configuration, which is basically a MySQL clone of the Oracle clustering endpoints. And it's very, I mean, you should talk to them about it if you're hosting, because they can have it so you can roll out like 4 or 6 servers, and 5 of them can go down, and the one is still hosting all your sites. My second point is that the movable type architecture, Byrne mentioned that 90% of the code 60part produces is open source. A huge part of that is the Memcache servers, the power sites like Dig, Yahoo, Google. A lot of big media companies all use Memcache. And then the Perl driver called Data Object Driver that makes it very easy to use Memcache and also to partition against many databases. And I think there's going to be a Athena demo later, but this technology is built natively into the next versions of the movable type platform, which will be out.
Yeah, I think you'll appreciate that as a LiveJournal user. A lot of the technology is LiveJournal invented and created and powers over 6 posts per second. And those are just posts; those aren't comments. Comments come in much greater volume in LiveJournal. A lot of the technology that they've developed, contributed to the open source community, that'll scale. A community of over 10 million users, over 3 million active users, again 6 posts per second. A lot of that technology is actually finding its way into the core of movable type, including data object driver, Memcache, things like that. Data object driver will have built into a database partition. You can actually have control as Serge was asking. You can have your comment database, all your comments live on one database and be physically located next to one set of servers. We actually want to from a network standpoint, want to locate those actually physically very close to one another. You can actually partition databases in that way. So there's more flexibility coming as far as the scalability. But as David pointed out, I think it's also important to point out that the reason why we integrate with Oracle, the reason why we integrate with SQL Server and those database systems is that they've solved a lot of those scaling problems with the database themselves. They've solved the backup and storage failover and disaster recovery scenario. That's why you pay $100,000 for Oracle, right? Because you buy insurance with them, and they own that whole database installation. As far as MT is concerned, as David pointed out, it's just an endpoint. You point Google type at your Oracle cluster, and Oracle does what it's designed to do. It's 12 years of engineering to do that. But if you want to take control of that, you want to own and support partitioning a cheaper solution like MySQL, that's fine.
Right, and I mean, I would say like it's sort of obviously Apperceptive works closely with 6part and as Textura and Apple Solutions do as well, and the other sort of Pronet members here. We work very closely with 6part, but if 6part was in the business of building like redundant databases, I would be angry. Like, I'm very glad that Sixpart is in the blogging business and is focused on blogging. Just personally, it's like I have a large personal dependency on Sixpart building great software. And so I feel like this architecture is exactly the right thing, where you can say, like, and Vern mentioned, partitioning these databases so that they're on different boxes. You can partition tables. So we have a client, and again, we'll talk later about sort of the community sites. We have like a large community client site where we have hundreds of thousands of potential users, right? And so in Movable Type, the empty session table is where all their login cookies are stored. So you can use Memcache to take your session table and put that on its own box, or even break up that table into 3 or 4 pieces and put that on different boxes. So maybe like your empty templates table has 300 or 500 rows, even on a very large install, right? There's no reason to build out a huge database scaling architecture for that. But if you really sort of get your hands dirty in the application, you see there's like the comments table, the session table, the entries table. We have sites that have like over 500,000 comments and 100,000 entries. I'm not like, my interest is moving the comments and sessions onto their own boxes. I'm less worried about the security aspects, as you noticed, and more worried about again, it's all about the user experience. Like, if I have an opinion about Top Chef, I want it to be projected into the world immediately. I don't want to wait.
Do you support Sybase as well?
Burn. But Data Object Driver is completely open source, so you can go to CPAN and look. If there was, for instance, actually a Sybase driver for Data Object Driver, it would be not trivial, but still relatively quickly to add a compatibility layer there.
All Movable Type SQL looks very, very standard.
To a pain point.
There are a few things we do on a platform-specific level to kind of take advantage of database-specific optimizations, but for the most part, gaining support for an additional database is actually relatively straightforward. So if you have special needs, then you can talk to us about it.
Tim, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just curious if you could share, like, in terms of hardware for these different groups, what tends to help these more than others? Is it memory? Is it processing speed?
Yeah, totally.
Disk space?
Right. I mean, if you have some plugins, great question. I mean, if you have like, a video encoding plugin, or if you have like a captcha on your comments, then you need processing power, right? If you're running like a photo upload site, you need processing power because Apache is going to hold those images in memory. It's going to build these image magic objects. It's going to resize them and rotate them and hold them in memory until like it makes sure it's not overwriting another image. That's sort of like, if you're doing the sort of like anything that is high computation like that, and the canonical example is encoding video, or doing some sort of math intensive application like building a comment captcha, that is processor power. In terms of like, if you are getting into the sort of scaling Apache, and I didn't talk about some of the things that Jay and Vern talked about earlier, which is like running your servers under FastCGI or modfcgid or mod Perl or something like that, those are very memory intensive processes. So you may have like a FastCGI process that is running and acting as a movable type server, and it lives, for hours or days. It's going to take up a lot of memory, and that's optimized. So you want it to live for a long time, and you want it to sort of spike and fall. But the way to make that work comfortably is to have a lot of memory. The one recommendation that we will make basically to all of our clients, irregardless of their needs, is having multi-core boxes, multi-processor boxes, because that, sort of more than doubles your capability when you're dealing with Apache and like Perl processing, and you're doing a lot of concurrent processes. Perl is just, has never been like a native threading language, but it's very good at sort of forking. So, and of course, almost all sites have more comments than entries. So, we make sure that the editor's experience is fantastic, but we'll always scale out the commenters, the commenters boxes, which has more memory and more horsepower. The database, as I said, always has the absolute most horsepower, because it is involved in every transaction. There's a lot of transaction. And the rebuild queue servers actually don't need a lot of memory. It's just building static pages. Obviously, when you have big templates, it builds a lot of pages. But these are usually not persistent processes. Even if it's a daemon that's picking up like a rebuilding job, pushing pages and dying, or sleeping. So you actually don't need a lot of memory for that. What you need is really fast disks. So, it's like building servers like this, it's like defensive driving, right? When you learned to drive when you were 16, it was like you were taught to avoid problems. You know what I mean? See the questionable driver, like see the area of greatest risk, and swerve way around it. And that's exactly what building servers is like, for us.
You were taught that?
My driver's license lapsed. I barely even leave the city anymore. I have 2 metro cars though. Yeah.
This might end up going to the 6 apart, but in terms of the stuff on code.6 apart and
Yeah.
in comparison to rebuild classic Q, where, if at all, do you place burn? Or is it just dead?
MT burn is not named after our burn. It's EURN. And basically, the way the plugin worked, we actually worked a lot. I spent a lot of hours with MT burn.
Yeah, there was a lot of attention, and then it kind of
Yeah,
went away when Q came
2
up.
years ago. And the way burn worked is it similar idea, which is to take the rebuilding load and templating load out of the Apache process. Is it basically would build a stub of a file, and then later, the first time someone called for that file, it would be built in real time. So if you had a very large site with very long archives, and you were building pages more often than you had to, then you could use burn basically to say like you have the best of dynamic and you have the best of static, because when your application is running, you don't get the performance hit that comes from things like disk writes and big database queries. But once the page is read once, you have the benefits of static performance, which is that file is always there. So the problems, this sounds great, and it was great, and I rolled it out on many production servers where it remains to this day. But the problem with it is, for instance, if you have like a blog with a lot of categories, say you have like a gadget blogs and gardening blogs, any sort of enthusiast blog, which is like a lot of great blogs are all about like enthusiasm, there are people who are likely to have many, many categories. So categories are also very expensive to build. So if you're using burn, and you get like swept by the Google bot, then you actually end up with like a worst case rebuild scenario where like you're concurrently building like 500 category archives with 100 entries each. Like take a blog like Gizmodo, right? And just like the volume of entries they had, the volume of categories they had, rebuilding all that is not going to be a good experience. So rebuild queue is actually sort of the best of both worlds, because you're not rebuilding in real time. You're almost definitely rebuilding it before someone asks for it. And you can actually stagger, as we were discussing earlier, you can stagger how often these pages are built. You can stagger how often individual kinds of templates and archives are built. So I can say like category archives, they're great for SEO, but they're not places where my community lives. My community lives on my indexes, my individual archives. So those pages have to be up to date. When I like all my Apple posts, like you could get updated every night, and that's fine.
You mentioned, we're focused a lot on kind of network architecture and rebuilding, and you kind of just mentioned fast CGI. Can you kind of share with the audience other ways you can actually, do performance tuning with Movable type?
Right. So I think fast CGI was discussed. It's basically a way to have your movable type processes live longer, take up sort of a less of a footprint on your servers. Load balancing these servers, I sort of glossed over, is similar. Basically, you can scale horizontally, have sort of cheaper, less expensive servers. So you scale horizontally instead of like constantly buying a bigger server. And if these processes are running fast CGI, then you can have a load balancer that figures out which is the server that's working the least and send processes to it. There's also, one of the things, and I don't mean to get right back to the rebuild queue burn, but one of the things the rebuild queue does is when it builds files, it logs how long it took to build that file. And like the number one performance problem, I don't mean to dog you guys, but the number one performance problem with movable type is movable type users who build crazy templates and do things like, I'm going to build a Google sitemap every minute. And then when you go to rebuild queue, you see like every minute I'm building this thing that takes a minute and a half to build. And that's why my site is slow, and that's why it takes a long time to comment. So when you use the rebuild queue, you can actually get some very nice data about how long each of those templates take to build. And we also distribute a plugin that benchmarks how long individual tags take to build. And this is something we use for our own, internally. Basically, we have a little hook, like a plugin hook, as Jay discussed, on the builder process that takes a benchmark every time it begins and leaves a tag or container tag. It says, this is how long I spent in this area. And so that lets you say, like, okay, I'm rebuilding, my blog takes 18 minutes to rebuild entirely. And of that time, 14 minutes is living in category tags. I need to somehow cache my category loops. I need to look at how my categories are structured. I need to look at how I'm rebuilding those. So, again, it's like defensive detail and defensive driving. It's like paying attention to details, figuring out where like the danger spots are, and staying clear.
That plugin you just mentioned.
Yeah.
That's released.
Yeah.
What's it
we distribute to like our clients, which is like more detail about all this stuff. And Bern and Marisa and Chris and all the people from 6-Part here also have this, and they can distribute it, or you can just send us an email. You can also email this PDF to you. You can also email builder.pm to you if you need it. So, and I, obviously have business cards, and I'll be here all day. Any more questions?
I'll also give David a copy of the card, kind of network architecture guide, just a higher level view of his presentation. It was really pretty pictures. And you can contact him as well if he can send you his presentation as well as that.
Yeah, and this guide that Bern wrote, actually, he wrote before we wrote our guide, and I've just sort of excerpted the graphics here, but it basically is like, we were distributing the 6-part guide to everybody, and everyone was saying, okay, but what about the servers? So we were sort of answering very specific questions. And if you look at Bern's guide and you have more specific questions, then we can work on documentation for that too. Everyone in the world wants more documentation, so we want to produce it. Any other questions?
Just a quick one.
Yeah.
So if you're using rebuild queue, is it possible to have it force a rebuild? Like if I make an edit to an entry, I need to rebuild right away.
Yeah, exactly. And this is clearly demonstrated by these two pink lines. Yeah, I mean,
That's what pink means.
pink is a signifier for. I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, there's an option in rebuild queue that Chad mentioned briefly that just says allow the CMS actions, the movable type actions, to override the rebuild queue action. So it's like, again, if you have an entry that you want to delete, or you made a typo, or you made a mistake, or you just want to delete something, you can do that with the CMS. I actually spent like 2 hours trying to figure out how to explain that in like a one-line preference checkbox, and failed. So if you check it out, have some advice about making that better. Yes, Byron? Yeah, I know, and
I didn't understand what you were saying.
I know.
Something hours went into this checkbox.
You're not, I mean, I think I've asked like 11 people in this room about the language in that checkbox, and it's just difficult to communicate, like, how, because this is like, again, it's a cycle that like movable type for like 5 to 6 years has been this like standalone thing that lives on your DreamHost account and your Pair account, and the idea of like really drilling into how the rebuild cycle works is something that not a lot of people have thought about, nor should you necessarily think about. But when you do need to think about it, there's not a large vocabulary for communicating